Okay guys, welcome to the first turn ever, I think that's been played since probably the 1800s of this game, Strategos, the basic version. I have reorganized the rules. This is version 0.06 for future reference. Reorganized the rules into something a little more palatable. This is about 30 some pages of rules. Anyway, the interesting thing about this game is it's a little bit jumbled as far as where the turn sequence is located. There is an overall sequence of play. There is within that sequence of play a separate section that had the turn sequence, and then there was also a section on initial deployments. So let me flip to the section on initial deployments just so I can go over this with you. So neither side may initially deploy into the middle ground. Now, this would be a deployment onto a battlefield that's already laid out. I've already said that for this game we're going to deploy onto it from the road, but traditionally skirmishers can't deploy any closer than 3 inches from the center line. Then behind them is the first line of battle, 5 inches back from the center line. In other words, 1 inch behind the skirmishers. Then you can form deeper lines. Your reserve force has to be 7 inches behind the second line of battle. There's no requirement to have these lines of battle in parallel. Participants should adjust their initial deployment to take advantage of the terrain laid down. Standards, which are the colors, right? Standards must be distributed along the line of battle. And I said in my introduction videos that there were 2 standards, one per brigade that was going to give to both sides. If one of the 2 ways that you can earn a victory is to capture the majority of standards. Well, majority of 2 is 2. But I was reviewing the rules this morning, and it turns out both sides also get a set of extra standards. It says 2 or 3 extra standards may be located with the brigade of the reserve and are used to replace those lost in action. So I'm giving everybody 2 additional standards. That means that the capture of 3 of those will lead to a victory. Okay, a center 4 fieldworks. Yeah, we don't need to talk about baggage because we're not bringing baggage on. The commander-in-chief, in other words, the brigadier general that's in charge of these divisions, is located in a central position in the rear of the second line of battle and midway between it and the reserve. And there are rules about the commander-in-chief, and if he gets way out front, he loses some of his immunities and can be captured. Okay. And then Totten wisely said that during the first round of play, it's recommended both players have no more than a single division of the line, which is what we're attempting here. And the playing area should be reduced in size. So in this case, we've got a map that's 3.5 inches, so 3.5 miles by 4 miles deep. So we're adhering to the rules of the initial deployment, at least insofar as the standards and his advice about terrain and his advice about doing a smaller playthrough. Okay, so then it goes into the turn sequence, but again, this turn sequence, we don't get to that until after we get through a couple of different phases to the game. So sequence of play. Initial dispositions. The longest edges of the table should be used as baselines for the opposing sides. Initial dispositions generally made behind a screen, raised in the middle central, but the screen is optional, right? If you do have a screen, then both sides get to do these 2 phases called reconnoitering and rearrangement. So the screen would be dropped for 1 to 5 minutes by the referee. Both sides could study the dispositions, challenge them if they're not in conformity with well-known military principles. The screen goes back up. Both sides get to rearrange their dispositions to take advantage of that. Now, it says that the movements can cost no more than 500 points to effectuate. It does not say whether those are maneuver points, which are different. It only costs 1 point per inch to make a maneuver move, so that would give you 500 inches of shifting stuff around, compared to the regular moves for infantry, artillery, and cavalry, which are significantly more costly. So could this be a typo? Could this be a problem? Don't know. This was not elucidated from another read through of the real rules. Okay. Changes made by one side and then the other side under the eye of the referee. If one side had challenged the dispositions, the changes have to come into conformity first before you can make any other rearrangements. Okay. Then you go into what's called an advance into fire move, set of movements. The screen gets dropped again. One side is being on the offensive. If it's designated in the scenario, the side with the offensive goes. If it's not designated, and this was the interesting thing about reading Totten, he uses the word initiative, right? The initiative will be decided by dice or by lot. Well, in this case, the scenario doesn't decide that, so I guess we're going to have to make a dice roll here. French and English dice, right? So we'll call the French side the Confederates, since Louisiana is down there, and we'll call the English side the Union. Okay, the initiative is going to go to the Confederates for the advance into fire phase. Next thing about advance and fire is the player having the initiative places 2 counters in reserve and then takes the 3rd counter, which is expended making moves. Okay, so here you'll see the slate down here that I've got. That's broken out into 3 counters, which is your main counter, and then your 2 reserve counters. And then there's also an IOU column here for forfeitures. So in this case, the Confederate, each of these counters is worth 50 points, 50 command points, basically. So the Confederates are going to go first. They get their 50 for their main counter. And then it says he can place 2 counters in reserve, so he's going to start with 50 points in both of those. No IOUs at this point. And if he wants to use a single reserve counter making moves during the advance into fire segment, he may do so as well. So that means I expend my regular counter, and then if I want to, I can tap into one of my reserve counters here. And when I run out of points or are satisfied with moves, then my turn is ended, and then the opponent makes a similar play. Okay? And that continues until there are at least 5 pieces, all belonging to the same side, within range of hostile pieces. No captures made during this advance and fire. Okay, so we'll have to do movement now. And this is the Confederate side. Movement, there are 2 different ways you can do movement. One way is called a maneuver move. Again, you've got to think about this like some kind of battle chess, right? The maneuver move is basically you can move in any direction just like a king, 1 square at a time. Maneuver moves actually only cost 1 command point per square that you move the unit. So this is a very cheap way to accomplish things. You can also stack units, in which case we call them ployed. If you stack 2 units, you can move them using a maneuver move. And my assumption there is that that means really you're getting 2 for the price of 1. If you come under fire or you want to move into squares that are covered by enemy fire, then you have to shift to your regular moves for cavalry, infantry, and artillery. Infantry moves left and right, top to bottom, much like a rook. The cavalry moves much like a knight in chess, over and up, and then you displace enemy figures in the squares that you can move to. And then lastly, artillery moves on the diagonals. So if you want to move an artillery piece forward, you've got to move it diagonally unless you want to make a maneuver move. And there are other rules about artillery moving too. So it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. I was surprised at the amount of sophistication in just a basic game for this 1880s rule set. And also amazed that it had command points and initiative and some other things that we kind of take for granted today. Okay, let me move some units. I'm going to pause the video right now. This video is brought to you by Warriors. So, movement. This assumes that there's a grid laid down here of 1 inches, 1 inch being 150 yards. So, like I said, if you make a maneuver move costs 1 of these points out of your command point balance. If, however, you make a regular move for infantry, let's say, it costs you 3 points, 2 for cavalry, 5 for artillery. So it's always best to do maneuver to begin with, which is what I'm going to do. And then also, if you're doing like a combined arms thing on a campaign map, you'd care about this all arms line, but otherwise you don't really need to worry about the average or this last line. Just these, which is the movement rate, right? For infantry, direct means straight up the board or straight across the board, so north-south or east-west. Oblique means on a diagonal. So one of my infantry units, I'm able to deploy 4 at a cost of 4 points. This other infantry unit that I'm bringing on, because the road goes obliquely, it's going to cost me only 3 points, but I'm only going to make 3 points of headway. And then I'll bring on my dismounted cavalry, which is acting as infantry as well here. And I'll continue to deploy units. But so far, so good. Pretty straightforward. All right, so the turn sequence also factors in here. First, there was an optional rule that for more experienced players, once you make a move, you're pretty much stuck with it. Well, I don't like that because I'm not an experienced player yet. And so what I found out was that I actually should have deployed my cavalry first, because they can get further along the roads than my infantry, which as an experienced wargamer, I should have known that. But anyway, I got caught up in deploying my infantry guys. But what has happened here is that over here on the oblique, this cavalry cost me 5 units. In other words, they're 5 inches onto the oblique on the board. This infantry unit is 3 inches on, so that's 8 points of my first counter that's expended. Then these guys can come out 7 if they're going straight. So 7 and 7, and then 5 and 5. And then I only brought these guys on 2 and 2. So I've got all my infantry deployed. I've got one of my batteries of artillery deployed. I've got my cavalry unit deployed. What I have over there to still deploy is my commander-in-chief, my 2 artillery batteries, and my engineers. But that's pretty good for the first turn. Now, I did have to go back and consult the rule book, because what it does say is that at the expert, you only get 10 minutes to make your move, right? Which I'm well over for this one. But at the end of that time, the unexpired, the points that you have not used out of your regular counter. Now remember, I had the option to tap into my reserve, but my regular counter, if I didn't expend all of those points, which in this case, I only used 36 of them, that means that there are 14 points that really I can't use. And unfortunate for me, that means that 14 points becomes a forfeiture, which then comes in and goes to the Union player's counter. So he gets 50 plus 14 that he can use on his turn, which is coming up. We're still calling this turn 1. But I'm going to make the Union moves now and figure out what happens with him. And actually looking at the turn sequence, so he doesn't get that 14 points yet, because each turn you expend your counter, then you pay forfeitures, make arbitrary captures, expend your points of your regular counter, expend up to 2 reserve counters, and then it moves over to the opponent. So in this case, my IOU actually won't be paid until turn 2. So he only gets his first move with 50 points, which I don't think is a big deal here, but as we're learning together. So also, I thought that I might actually have owed my opponent a forfeiture, because my standards are not with the front line. I started to question myself about that. Well, reviewing the rules about the standards, it doesn't say anything about this advance into fire phase, but it does say that the skirmishing phase, which comes next, the colors don't move. So it's only during general engagement turns that the colors move forward with the general advance of the army without expenditure of points, and may never be moved more than 1 square behind the first line of battle. Otherwise, you forfeit 10 points per standard, left too far behind. Well, since we're not to the general engagement phase yet, I don't have to worry about a forfeiture related to having my standard, buried back here. As a matter of fact, I don't even have to move them forward at this point. Okay, you can see that I've moved the Union forces now. Quite a lot of congestion on those roads, as expected. As it turns out, artillery can actually move pretty fast on the roads, but I still wanted my cavalry out in front of those just because of the nature of what I want them to be able to do. Anyway, That move cost me a grand total of 38 command points, which off of 50 leaves 12, which I could not use, which means that I owe my opponent 12 points. I mean, in theory, you could cancel these out, but the rules are pretty specific about forfeitures and when it comes in the turn sequence. So I don't think we should play loosey-goosey with the rules. I think we should play them as is. This is probably my favorite artillery battery of all time. They're detached from Gerard's unit, which is operating out here further to the east in Roswell. I figured Gerard didn't need artillery, but this is the Chicago Board of Trade Independent Light Artillery Battery. How about that? The Chicago Board of Trade Independent Light Artillery Battery is right up front here and will be in this fight. So I've got all my artillery batteries out at this point. I've got one of my 3 regiments of infantry out there. Again, the Union has just so much stuff. And then he's got his 2 cavalry units right up front here, the 12th Kentucky Cavalry and the 16th Illinois Cavalry Regiment, part thereof. Okay, that's it for turn number 1, and we're going to move on to turn number 2 next.